His cherished garden, a living tribute to his late mother, became a battlefield with one letter from the HOA, a $10,000 fine for violating the rules. The HOA president, smug and untouchable, sneered at James, declaring, "Rules are rules. Pay up or tear it down." What she didn't realize was that her reign of power was on borrowed time. When the truth came to light, the fallout shook not just her, but the entire neighborhood. But let's start from the beginning. James Carter's house in Cedar Ridge wasn't just a home, it was a canvas of memories and dreams. The air in his garden always seemed fresher, the colors more vibrant. Rows of tulips lined the walkway like cheerful sentinels, and his mother's hybrid orchid, a delicate pink bloom that seemed to glow, stood proudly in the center. James called it Mom's masterpiece. But on that bright, sunny day, the tranquility shattered. A neatly folded envelope sat in his mailbox, its return address stamped with the HOA logo. The moment James opened it, his heart sank. The letter, riddled with legal jargon, boiled down to one sentence. "Your garden violates Cedar Ridge's landscaping policy. Failure to comply will result in a $10,000 fine." James blinked at the words, his mind racing. Was this a joke? A typo? He reread it, hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into something reasonable. But they didn't. The HOA, under Karen Whitman's rule, had always been strict, but fining him for flowers? Karen was infamous in the neighborhood. To most, she was the quintessential suburban tyrant, always immaculate in her pastel suits, with an icy smile that hid a ruthlessness no one dared to challenge. Her word was law, and now it seemed her gaze had turned to James. At first, James tried to shake it off. It's probably a misunderstanding, he told himself, but deep down he knew better. Karen didn't make mistakes. She made examples. Determined to resolve the issue amicably, James attended the next HOA meeting. The room buzzed with polite chatter as neighbors filled the chairs, but the atmosphere shifted when Karen entered. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, commanding attention. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood, holding photos of his garden. His voice was steady, though frustration simmered beneath the surface. "This is my yard," he said, passing the pictures around. "I've reviewed the bylaws, and there's nothing prohibiting what I've done. These flowers mean a lot to me. I'd like to understand why I'm being fined." Karen glanced at the photos, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned forward, her manicured nails drumming the table. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter. Cedar Ridge has a standard for landscaping, and your garden, well, it doesn't meet the aesthetic." The room fell silent. A few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. James took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. "Karen, with all due respect, this isn't about aesthetics. My garden doesn't violate any rules." Karen leaned back, her smile widening. "That's your opinion, Mr. Carter, but the HOA has spoken. You can pay the fine or remove the garden. The choice is yours." The casual dismissal sent a wave of anger through James. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice measured. This isn't about rules, it's about control. Karen's eyes flashed, and for a moment, her mask of civility slipped. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut. "Careful, Mr. Carter. Challenging the HOA rarely ends well." James left the meeting with more questions than answers. As he walked back to his house, the vibrant blooms in his garden seemed to mock him. What had once been his sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. This wasn't just about a fine. It was a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. And if Karen thought James would back down, she was in for a surprise. James Carter had never been one to shy away from a challenge, especially when it came to something he cared about deeply. His garden wasn't just a collection of plants, it was a labor of love, a tribute to his late mother, and his personal retreat from the chaos of the world. So, when the HOA demanded its removal, James decided to fight back. Late into the evenings, his living room became his war room. The dining table, once a place for quiet dinners, was now covered with HOA bylaws, legal guides, and a well-thumbed notebook filled with his own observations. He combed through the rules line by line, determined to find anything that could justify the fine, or more importantly, prove it unwarranted. For days, the only sound in his house was the rustle of papers and the occasional sigh of frustration. But then, late one night, he found it. A glaring omission. Nowhere in the HOA's bylaws was there a mention of landscaping uniformity. His garden didn't break any rules. Armed with this knowledge, James wrote a formal letter disputing the fine and sent it directly to Karen Whitman. The reply came faster than expected, and it was nothing short of infuriating. Karen dismissed his argument outright and escalated the threat. If he didn't comply, the HOA would place a lien on his property. Reading those words, James felt his hands tremble, not with fear, but with a simmering anger. This isn't about rules, he muttered to himself. This is about power. Determined not to stand alone, James began speaking with his neighbors. At first, he wasn't sure what to expect. Would they side with Karen, ignore his plight? But to his surprise, many shared their own stories of arbitrary fines and absurd demands. One neighbor, a retired teacher, confessed she'd paid over $1,000 in fines for a mailbox too colorful for community standards. Another admitted that Karen had forced him to repaint his front door 3 times in 1 year. James quickly realized that Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was exploiting them. Worse still, whispers about the HOA's finances painted an alarming picture. Karen's luxurious new SUV, frequent spa visits, and even her vacation home seemed suspiciously extravagant for someone on a community salary. It was clear James needed professional help. He contacted Lisa Hall, a local attorney known for her expertise in property disputes. Lisa, a sharp and no-nonsense woman, listened intently as James explained his situation. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "We've got a case," she said. Lisa's first advice was simple but crucial: gather evidence. Together, they started building a case, focusing on Karen's misuse of HOA funds and the lack of legal grounds for the fine. Lisa also suggested James install security cameras. "If she's as bold as you say, she might retaliate," Lisa warned. And retaliate Karen did. Exactly 1 week after their first meeting, James stepped outside to find his heart sink. The rare orchid that had been his mother's pride and joy was gone, ripped from the soil. On the driveway, crude letters sprayed in bright red paint spelled out, "Comply or else." James stared at the message, a storm of emotions raging inside him. Shock, anger, sadness. But most of all, resolve. Karen had crossed the line, and there was no going back now. The cameras had caught everything. The footage showed 2 men in hooded sweatshirts sneaking into his yard under the cover of darkness. While their faces were obscured, their movements were deliberate, and one of them carried a can of spray paint. James immediately called Lisa, who was equally appalled. "This isn't just harassment, it's vandalism," she said, "and we're going to make sure they pay for it." As James stood in his now damaged garden, the once vibrant space felt strangely empty. But he wasn't defeated. If anything, the sight of the vandalism strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about his garden anymore. It was about standing up to a system that had bullied an entire community for far too long, and James Carter was ready for battle. Lisa Hall didn't waste a second once she took on James's case. Her office, a modest yet orderly space lined with legal books and neatly stacked folders, quickly became the command center for unraveling Karen Whitman's grip on Cedar Ridge. Lisa worked with the precision of a surgeon and the tenacity of a detective. Every document James provided was dissected, every HOA meeting transcript scrutinized, and every financial record traced. What she uncovered was staggering. First, there were the bank transfers. Thousands of dollars of HOA funds mysteriously funneling into Karen's private accounts under vague descriptions like administrative costs and community enhancements. But the real enhancements, as Lisa pointed out with a wry smile, seemed to be Karen's luxury SUV and regular spa weekends. Then came the falsified meeting minutes. Karen had manipulated records to claim unanimous approval for rules no one had ever heard of. Rules that conveniently allowed her to fine residents for arbitrary violations that often forced elderly neighbors to sell their homes under mounting financial pressure. The more Lisa dug, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was exploiting them for personal gain. And James knew it was time to act. Fueled by anger and a renewed sense of purpose, James filed a lawsuit against the HOA and Karen personally. The move was bold, and it sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, and soon, local journalists picked up the story. Flower Garden Feud, HOA, President accused of fraud, blared the headline on the Cedar Ridge Gazette. Karen, predictably, didn't take the accusations lying down. At first, she dismissed them with her usual icy confidence, calling James a troublemaker and accusing him of harassment. She even went so far as to host an emergency HOA meeting, where she painted James as a man bent on destroying community harmony. But Karen underestimated just how fed up the neighborhood was. As the story gained traction, neighbors began coming forward with their own experiences. A retired nurse shared how Karen had fined her for not trimming a hedge that didn't even belong to her property. A single father recounted being forced to repaint his home 3 times in 2 years, each time under a different pretense. The stories painted a picture of a leader who had turned the HOA into a personal fiefdom, and the tide was turning against her. Even the local news stations picked up the scandal, with reporters camping outside Karen's house, peppering her with questions as she rushed to her car. For once, her polished composure seemed to crack. James, meanwhile, found himself at the center of a growing movement. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now rallied behind him, inspired by his courage to stand up to Karen's intimidation. Lisa continued to build the case, collecting testimonies and compiling a mountain of evidence that seemed almost too egregious to be true, despite Karen's attempts to retaliate, threatening counter-lawsuits and even spreading rumors about James's intentions. The truth was spreading faster than she could contain it. The community began to see her not as a leader, but as a bully hiding behind a thin veneer of authority. Through it all, James remained focused. This wasn't about personal vindication anymore. It was about justice, not just for his garden, but for everyone Karen had wronged. Standing in his yard one evening, watching the first signs of new blooms sprouting where his mother's orchid had once stood, James felt a quiet determination settle over him. Karen had underestimated the resilience of the people she had spent years suppressing. And now, her empire was starting to crumble. The courtroom buzzed with a nervous energy on the morning of the hearing. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. James sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly as Lisa Hall organized the evidence with methodical precision. Across the aisle, Karen Whitman adjusted her pastel blazer, her usual air of confidence barely masking the tension in her rigid posture. The judge, a stern yet fair figure, entered the room, and silence fell like a curtain. What followed was a masterclass in accountability. Lisa rose to her feet, her tone calm but commanding. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Miss Whitman used her position as HOA president to exploit the residents of Cedar Ridge for personal gain. This is not a case of mere negligence. This is deliberate corruption." James couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. Lisa was in her element, and the courtroom was her stage. She began with the financial records, displaying a series of bank transactions on the courtroom's projector. Each highlighted transfer was a dagger aimed squarely at Karen's credibility. These funds, taken directly from the HOA's account, were used for personal expenses, luxury vehicles, spa retreats, and even private vacations, all paid for by residents under the guise of community improvements. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the edges of the table. But Lisa wasn't done. She moved on to the falsified meeting minutes, pointing out the discrepancies with laser-like focus. These documents claim unanimous approval for policies that were never discussed, let alone voted on. Miss Whitman's signature appears on every one of them, despite testimony from multiple residents stating they were unaware of these changes. Then came the video footage, the smoking gun. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the screen showed Karen's associates sneaking into James's garden under the cover of darkness, spray painting the driveway and ripping out the orchid. Karen's facade of confidence cracked. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering frantically, but the damage was done. The final blow came from the testimonies. One by one, residents took the stand, their voices steady but filled with emotion. An elderly man spoke about losing his home after being fined for unapproved modifications to a roof he couldn't afford to replace. A single mother described the sleepless nights worrying about how to pay escalating HOA dues. Each story painted a picture of systemic abuse, and the weight of it all settled heavily on the room. When it was finally Karen's turn to speak, her once icy demeanor had melted into visible discomfort. She stammered through vague justifications, but the judge wasn't buying it. Miss Whitman, the judge said, his tone as sharp as the gavel in his hand, it is abundantly clear that you used your position to run this HOA as your personal fiefdom. Your actions were not only unethical, but illegal. James felt a lump rise in his throat. This was it, the moment of justice he had fought so hard for. The verdict was swift and decisive. The $10,000 fine against James was nullified. Karen Whitman was removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately, and the HOA was ordered to pay significant damages to James and other affected residents. But the consequences didn't stop there. The judge referred Karen for criminal investigation, citing clear evidence of embezzlement and fraud. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, her once pristine image lay in tatters. James sat in silence for a moment, letting the reality of the victory sink in. The fight had been long and exhausting, but in that moment, surrounded by neighbors who were finally free of Karen's oppressive rule, he felt a deep sense of relief. As he stepped outside, the crisp air carried the faint scent of flowers. For the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Justice had been served, and Cedar Ridge was finally free to bloom again. The transformation in Cedar Ridge was palpable. With Karen gone, the dark cloud of her rule lifted, and the neighborhood seemed to breathe again. The HOA, once a symbol of fear and control, was under new leadership, residents who genuinely cared about the community and its well-being. Their first act? Transparency. Financial records were made public, meetings became open forums, and the oppressive fines that had plagued so many were abolished. James watched these changes with a mix of relief and quiet pride. His once vandalized garden, now fully restored, stood as a testament to resilience. The tulips had returned, vibrant and upright. The roses, with their deep crimson hues, swayed gently in the breeze. And in the center of it all, a new orchid bloomed, a gift from a grateful neighbor who'd been inspired by James's fight. Every morning, James would step out onto his porch with a cup of coffee, the aroma mingling with the scent of his flowers. His garden had become more than just a personal sanctuary. It was now a gathering place. Neighbors often stopped by, some with gardening tips, others just to chat. Conversations that once centered on fear of HOA retribution now blossomed into discussions about plans for a community garden, shared events, and ways to ensure such injustice would never happen again. James, though still weary from the long battle, found solace in these moments. He knew he had done the right thing, not just for himself, but for everyone in Cedar Ridge. Sometimes, he thought, you don't realize how strong your roots are until someone tries to uproot you. The ripple effects of his fight reached far beyond the borders of the neighborhood. Local news stations picked up his story, and soon James found himself flooded with emails and letters from people across the country. Some shared their own struggles with corrupt HOAs. Others simply thanked him for showing that it was possible to stand up and win. One particularly moving letter came from an elderly couple in a neighboring state. They'd been forced to sell their home after years of relentless fines and harassment. Your story gave us hope, they wrote. We're inspired to take a stand and make sure no one else goes through what we did. James didn't consider himself a hero. He was just a man who refused to let injustice take root in his life. But seeing how his actions inspired others, he realized the power of standing firm, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The new HOA leadership often sought his advice, and while James declined any formal role, he remained a guiding presence. At one meeting, he addressed the residents, his voice steady but full of conviction. This community isn't about rules or fines, he said. It's about people. It's about respect, fairness, and standing together when it matters most. His words resonated deeply, sparking a renewed sense of unity among the neighbors. Those who once avoided HOA meetings now attended regularly, eager to contribute ideas and ensure transparency. Together, they rebuilt the sense of trust that Karen had eroded over the years. As the seasons changed, so did Cedar Ridge. The neighborhood blossomed, both figuratively and literally. The community garden became a reality, a vibrant space filled with laughter, shared stories, and, of course, flowers. James's garden, once a battleground, now stood as a symbol of hope and resilience. And every time he looked at the new orchid in its rightful place, he was reminded that even the smallest seed of courage could grow into a revolution.